Sometimes you feel a strange emptiness. It's not pain, and it's not quite sadness either. It feels more like homesickness for something you can't name, a missing piece of something you never really understood. And still, it's been living inside you for a long time. Some days, that emptiness just sits there, not loud, just there, like something waiting. You try to keep moving, and you keep yourself busy. You pretend it's nothing, but deep down, you feel it pulling. And maybe it's not about something that left. Maybe it's about a part of you had to leave behind. Do you remember that part of you that laughed for no reason? That cried out loud without fear of being judged? That believed in things without needing proof? It didn't disappear. It just went into hiding. It's still there, looking at you from the inside, waiting for you to listen, waiting for you to remember. And sometimes, that hole in your chest that seems to have no name is just your child self whispering softly, "I'm still here." Hi, I'm Noah. This video isn't some big Hollywood production. It's just a way I found to share with you what I learned about myself today through what I've been learning from Carl Jung. Because maybe the moment I'm living through feels a lot like something you're living too. So if something I say here helps you feel a little less alone, just give it a like and subscribe to the channel. That way, YouTube understands that this kind of content matters to you, and it'll start showing you more of it. Sometimes there's this strange emptiness inside you that you just can't explain. It's not really sadness, not exactly anger either. It's more like a quiet weight in your chest, like something important got left behind a long time ago. And no matter how much you try to move on, it keeps pulling you back. It shows up in those moments when everything finally gets quiet. When you're alone. When something in your body feels full of silence, but not peace. That whisper can turn into exhaustion with no clear reason, or into a sudden irritation that spills over onto someone you love. It can come as a dream, the symbolic kind, where you wake up with a strange image stuck in your head and a tight feeling in your chest that lingers all day. Sometimes it's just a faint memory or a feeling that lives in your body with no name. But all of it is symbolic language. It's how your psyche tries to speak when words aren't enough. That voice inside you doesn't scream. It whispers, and its name is your inner child. A living part of your psyche that never died, just got quiet. When she appears as shadow, it's not with anger. It's with longing. She misses you. She misses who you were before you shut yourself down to fit in, before you started hiding just to stay safe. And even without words, this part of you has never stopped trying to reach out. She shows up in little ways. When you struggle to trust, when you're afraid to feel too much, when silence makes you want to run. She's there when you feel lonely, even surrounded by people. When you react like you're still 7 years old, and you don't know why. When you find yourself wanting to disappear for no reason. These aren't signs of weakness. They're messages, emotional expressions from a place that time didn't erase, just buried. What's hardest is how easily we learn to ignore that voice. Because listening to the inner child hurts. It hurts to remember things no one let you feel. It hurts to admit that behind all your strength, there's still a fragile part of you quietly asking to be held. But we've been taught to avoid fragility, to swallow our tears, to keep moving like nothing happened. But something did happen, and it's still happening. Every time you pretend you're fine, the personal unconscious doesn't forget what your conscious mind tries to bury. It finds ways to remind you, through dreams, through symptoms, through repeating patterns. The personal shadow isn't a monster. It's a part of you frozen in time. And that part still feels, still aches, still dreams. It doesn't want to ruin your life. It wants to be part of it. And what it needs first isn't fixing. It's listening. You don't have to understand everything right now. Just pause for a second and ask, what part of me is trying to be remembered? What is this emptiness really saying? What if this silence isn't a problem, but a whisper? And what if that whisper has been saying the same thing all along? I'm still here. Do you remember the last time you felt whole? Not on the outside, on the inside. When you didn't have to prove anything to anyone. When you didn't have to hide how you felt. Maybe that memory is blurry now. Maybe it got lost somewhere in the rush to grow up. In the fear of letting people down. In the need to be accepted. For a lot of us, growing up meant forgetting. Not just things, ourselves. The deepest pain wasn't what others did to you. It was what you had to do to yourself, just to make it. You learned to stay quiet before you even knew what you wanted to say. You learned to smile without meaning it, to hold back tears, to act strong while falling apart. Slowly, you let go of your spontaneity, your sensitivity, your purest desires. Not because you wanted to, but because you sensed that being fully yourself wasn't welcome. And that's where self-abandonment began. You built a version of your ego that could adapt, one that could function, but not feel. That repression wasn't a mistake. It was a survival instinct, a way to secure love, safety, belonging. But it came with a cost. An inner child who learned to live in silence, who learned how to survive without being seen. She became emotional shadow, present but hidden, still there, still feeling, still carrying repressed impulses, unnamed emotions, forgotten memories, disowned parts of you that were once told, feeling too much is weakness. And now, the confrontation with the shadow begins. But it doesn't come with rage. It comes with questions, with discomfort, with this strange sense that something inside you still aches, even if you can't explain why. It's like your body remembers what your mind tried to forget. Like there's a quiet longing for the self you once were, unfiltered, unafraid, untouched by the need to shrink. That pain isn't your enemy. It's the trail back to what was left behind. Every time you feel that sting in your chest, that sudden urge to cry, that exhaustion that no amount of sleep can fix, maybe it's not weakness. Maybe it's the emotional shadow asking to be heard. Your ego doesn't need to fight her. It needs to see her, to recognize that what was once repressed still holds value. That the part of you who was soft, wild, and full of life still wants to live. Emotional integration begins like this, when you stop denying what you feel, when you sit with the emotion instead of running from it, when you realize that what got silenced wasn't wrong, it was just too real for the world you grew up in. But now, the world is different, and so are you. Now there's space to welcome what was once shut down, to look at that child and say, I see you. You can come back now, because growing up without yourself isn't the end of the story. It can be the beginning of your return. And that return starts with courage, yes, but also with tenderness, with choosing not to abandon yourself again. Because this time, unlike before, you get to choose to listen. And if you feel like going a little deeper, I carefully prepared a gift for you. It may look small on the outside, but it goes deep. It was made for those quiet moments when you suddenly notice you're here, but not really present. You're breathing, but not really alive. Inside, you won't find answers or fixes, but you might find a way back. Back to the parts of you that got left behind. Back to the gentle voice you stopped listening to. Back to your true self. The one that still remembers who you are. Not a better version of yourself. Not a new version of yourself. Just a whole version of yourself. You'll find the link to your gift right there in the pinned comment. So, if your soul is tired of moving through life without really feeling it, if your soul is tired of waking up and not knowing why, click the link now. Some of the reactions you feel today weren't born today. They come from far back, from a time when you didn't even know how to protect yourself. But your body remembers, and your psyche keeps the score. So when something familiar happens, a certain tone, a small rejection, a simple demand, the reaction feels bigger than the moment. Fear that freezes, anger that explodes, sadness that doesn't match the situation. You don't know why you're feeling all this. You just do, as if you've become small again. These reactions aren't madness. They're unconscious responses. The psyche tries to shield what was never fully digested. It does this by reactivating old emotions as if the danger is still here. That's why sometimes you react like you're 8 years old, even though you're 30, because a part of you got stuck there, frozen in a moment that hurt too much, a moment that had no space for feeling or for comfort. That's where the personal shadow holds on to your repressed emotions and unconscious impulses, breaking into the present without asking. But they are deep emotional defenses. They are disowned parts of the self that learn to protect you however they could. When someone pulls away and you panic, when a small no breaks you, when silence feels like abandonment, all of that is shadow trying to say, there's still pain here, a wound that never closed. The relationship between the ego and the shadow is made of moments like this. You think you're reacting to now, but you're really reacting to then. Carl Jung once said that what we do not make conscious will appear in our lives as fate. That's exactly what happens when the unconscious content from childhood leaks into your adult life. And if the ego doesn't understand this, it tries to fix or shame itself. But there's no need. These reactions don't ask for correction. They ask for care. This unconscious behavior isn't the problem. It's the symptom. It reveals a past that still wants to be seen, not to trap you, but to free you. Because as long as those parts stay buried, they'll keep reacting. But when you start listening, the psyche softens. Slowly, these reactions gain context. They stop being monsters and become parts of you with names, stories, and truth. Healing doesn't begin with control. It begins with compassion, with recognizing that your anger, fear, or desperation isn't weakness, it's memory. Your psyche carries memories your conscious mind forgot. And those memories don't want to ruin you. They just want to be seen. Maybe, for the first time, you can look at them with tenderness and say, I know you reacted to protect me, but now I can take care of us. These emotional reactions that seem too much are actually just enough for what still hurts. They are honest responses from a part of you that still believes the world is dangerous. But now, you can turn to that part and say, I've grown. And even if it still hurts, I'm here. I hear you, I see you, and I won't leave you behind. Some people learned early on that feeling was dangerous, that needing others was weakness, that depending on anyone was the fastest way to get hurt. So they grew up armored, became strong, independent, in control. No one could get too close. No one could see too much. And after wearing that armor for so long, they forgot they weren't born this way. They forgot there was once a child behind the wall, sensitive, intense, hungry for love. A child who never got held. That child, to survive, had to hide. And in her place came an image of strength. The persona of self-sufficiency. The one who never cries, never asks for help, never lets her guard down. But that mask, the one that once protected, now weighs heavy. It suffocates the psyche, holds down repressed impulses, silences long-buried grief and forgotten longing. The shadow here doesn't explode. It shows up as silence, as fatigue, as constant tension in a body trying to carry what it can no longer bear. The denial of the shadow makes it seem like everything's fine, like loneliness is a choice, like pride is safety. But the body knows better. It feels everything, and it responds with insomnia, anxiety, tight throats, chest pain. That's the Psyche-soma connection trying to speak. Something inside needs to be felt, needs to be seen, because this fortress you've built isn't who you are. It's who you had to become to survive. But no one can be a rock forever. When the ego tries to uphold a rigid image, it becomes exhausted because it has to silence all the other parts. And those disowned parts of the self, the playful, emotional, vulnerable ones, are still alive inside you, just locked away. And the more the ego denies them, the heavier the shadow becomes, the louder the body screams, the less joy you feel. Behind every "I don't need anyone" lives a quiet truth. No one ever taught me that I could. That's the core wound for so many, believing they had to be strong to be loved. And deep down, that's a form of psychological repression, a survival strategy that buries the parts that most needed care. But it never fully works, because the inner child is still there, still waiting for the moment when you'll look at her without shame and say, "You didn't have to be that strong all alone." Healing begins when you remember you weren't born with that armor. You built it out of pain, and now, maybe, it's time to start laying it down, gently, with respect, with kindness, with listening. Your psyche doesn't want you to fall apart. It just wants you to come home to yourself, to finally say, "I deserve to be held too." Because the weight of being too strong only exists where there's abandonment. And if you soften your eyes enough to look at the fortress you built, you might see this. Behind it, there's still a heart waiting for permission to rest. Not every inner child is just a wound. Sometimes she's a key that opens a door to a place inside you, a place you forgot was even there, a place where everything is still alive, where feeling is allowed, imagining is free, and being is whole. In Jungian psychology, this child isn't just about trauma. She's an archetype, a sacred image of the soul in its purest form. And to reconnect with her is to remember who you were when no one was watching. When the psyche approaches this child, it isn't returning to the past. It's making space for a more honest present. Because this child is a symbol of psychic regeneration. She doesn't care about performance. She craves presence. She's not asking for explanations, just truth. And there's nothing childish about that. In fact, it's deeply human. Because this child holds the original impulse of your being, the spark of your truest desire. The voice that existed before the world taught you to silence it. Carl Jung saw this image as a symbol of the self, the deep center of the soul that reveals itself in symbolic ways throughout life. The child is one of those ways. That's why she shows up in dreams, in emotional echoes, in nameless longings. She's trying to remind you that what's essential never dies. It may get buried, silenced, repressed, but it still pulses, waiting for space to breathe again. This child doesn't want you to go back. She wants to regenerate the present. She's not asking you to become who you were. She wants you to become whole now. And that can only happen when the ego stops fighting the shadow and begins to listen. When the adult chooses not to repeat the same repression they once lived through and instead begins to truly live. Because this return to the inner child is the beginning of the path Jung called individuation, the journey home to yourself. The shadow, in this case, doesn't appear as pain, but as forgetting, as something you left behind without realizing. But when you start to remember, in your body, your heart, your breath, that memory turns back into life. Life stops being just a task and becomes presence. Feeling stops being weakness and becomes a guide. And you stop living on autopilot and start living with meaning. Psychic wholeness isn't about being perfect. It's about rhythm, a flow of listening between all your parts. And the inner child in that rhythm is like a bell that rings inside your soul, calling you back home, not to hide from the world, but to live in it with truth, with creativity, with freedom. Because when the symbolic child awakens, the inner world begins to breathe again. And with it, everything starts to make sense. Healing doesn't mean erasing the past. It means allowing the most alive part of your soul to live again, now. And if one day you ask yourself, where do I begin? The answer might come in a soft smile, a quiet breath, or a symbolic dream. And inside it, a voice whispering, start with me. Not all pain asks for answers. Some pain just wants to be heard. And to truly listen doesn't mean fixing, it means being with. It means creating space for the forgotten part of you to speak without fear of being interrupted. When the inner child starts to come forward, she isn't asking for a solution. She's asking for presence. She wants to know if this time you'll stay, if you'll listen without rushing to explain. Because healing begins when someone finally pauses to listen without correcting. The shadow in this moment doesn't show up as conflict. It appears as a gesture, a body that cries without knowing why, a memory that returns out of nowhere, a word stuck in your throat, and if you resist, it goes quiet again. But if you listen, truly listen, with your heart open, it begins to trust you. Because for once, it doesn't have to fight to exist. That's the beginning of shadow integration, when the ego stops controlling and starts allowing. This kind of listening isn't passive. It's active in a symbolic way. It's symbolic listening, the kind that knows not all pain makes sense, and that suffering doesn't need explanation to deserve compassion. Jung called this the transcendent function, the bridge between the ego we became and the soul we still feel. It comes alive when opposites begin to look at each other with less fear, when what was disowned is finally welcomed, not changed, just included. Those disowned parts of the self, once loud in the form of symptoms, begin to soften when they feel they no longer need to disappear. And that changes everything, because the psyche, when it senses it's allowed to be whole, stops overcompensating. It reorganizes, it breathes, not because it was fixed, but because it was heard. That's emotional integration. That's a living process. That's the symbol made flesh, a body no longer at war with itself. The reconciling of opposites isn't a sudden miracle. It's a gesture repeated, a rhythm, a new way of being with your feelings, without fear, without urgency, without shame. Because the inner child doesn't need ready-made answers. She needs truth. And truth is born from listening, from choosing not to run, from staying even when it hurts, even when you don't know what to do. This quiet listening transforms, because when the ego begins to listen to the shadow with respect, the soul starts showing the way. It speaks through dreams, through feelings, through symbols, and each symbol carries a piece of you that wants to return. The symbolic language of the psyche isn't seeking logic, it's seeking wholeness. And you don't need to understand everything right now, you just need to be present, to listen, to feel, to allow. Because maybe, in the end, integrating the shadow is just this: saying to yourself, I won't interrupt me anymore. There comes a time when pain no longer needs to hurt in order to exist. It becomes something else, a gesture, a sound, a laugh. When you begin to embrace the shadow, what once held you back becomes expression. What was once a weight becomes a path. The inner child, once hidden, starts showing up in small ways. In your shifting voice, the way you dance alone, the courage to feel without apologizing. And for the first time, you feel free inside yourself. That's what the integrated shadow is. Not the absence of pain, but a new relationship with it. You stop hiding, stop fighting, stop pretending you're not feeling, and instead, you begin to transform. You begin to create. Because pain that's been heard becomes symbol, becomes living material. And the psyche, once it knows it's allowed to be whole, starts to play again. But now, play is sacred, a way of being real. Authenticity doesn't come from trying to be original. It comes from letting all your parts be seen, even the ones the world told you were too much. When the shadow is welcomed, it reveals gifts that were once asleep. Sensitivity, intensity, creativity. All of this starts breathing again when you loosen control. And what was once a symptom becomes expression. What was once too much becomes power. Life stops being just survival and begins to pulse with meaning. This is the soul's pulse, And it doesn't follow rules, it follows rhythm. A rhythm that may not fit the world's demands, but fits you perfectly. And the more you listen to that rhythm, the more you reconnect with yourself. Because the self doesn't shout. It whispers, it plays, it moves. It lives in whatever makes you feel truly alive. This kind of psychic freedom isn't about doing whatever you want without limits. It's about existing in wholeness. It's about saying, this is me too. It's about knowing your sensitive, intense, even contradictory parts also deserve a voice. Because every part of you has something to say. And when they're all heard, something new appears. Lightness, not as escape, but as truth. A lightness born from acceptance, from reconnection, from presence. This is the quiet miracle of unconscious expression, when what was hidden becomes your way of being. You begin to speak without fear, to feel without guilt, to play like someone who honors life. Because now, everything in you has a place. The shadow is no longer silence, it's sound, it's color, it's motion. It's the living symbol of a process that didn't erase the pain. It turned it into a path. And maybe that's what your inner child always meant when she tried to speak. I didn't come to stop you from growing. I came to remind you that life can be light too. In the end, maybe what you needed most wasn't to understand, but to listen. And when you finally do, you realize that distant voice you kept hearing. It never left. It had only been forgotten. I'm still here. That phrase doesn't come from the past. It rises from the present, from deep within your psyche, where your inner child has always lived. She was simply waiting for you to find the courage to look inward, without fear. This reunion isn't magical, but it is sacred, because it doesn't happen in the mind, it happens in the body. It happens when something inside starts to breathe again, when a part of you no longer screams because it has finally been heard. The personal shadow, now integrated, isn't a wall anymore, it's a bridge between what the ego tried to forget and what the soul never stopped holding. Not to return to the past, but to walk forward in truth. The phrase, I'm still here, is a tender reminder that you were never fully lost, just a little far from yourself. And now, with this listening awakened, what was once unconscious starts taking shape, gaining color, gaining name. This is what it means to make the unconscious conscious, not as a theory, but as presence. The inner child returns, not needing rescue, but arriving as a guide, a living symbol of yourself. And now, the reconciling of opposites begins quietly. What was split starts to reconnect. What was conflict becomes care. The adult you've become looks inward and finds something they didn't know still existed. A bond. An inner, emotional, symbolic bond. It's not perfection, it's emotional integration. And that changes everything. Because now you don't have to choose between being strong and feeling. You can be both. You can be whole. The shadow is no longer your enemy. It becomes your ally. And life, once heavy, begins to feel different. Not because everything is light now, but because you no longer carry it alone. You carry it with yourself, with that old, forgotten, living part of you. The inner child never wanted answers. She just wanted company. And now, she has it. Because you stopped. You listened. You stayed. This is the symbolic end. And the real beginning. Because now, the symbolic process is no longer an idea. It's a path you've walked. Your consciousness expands. Your soul breathes. Your body feels. The ego and the self meet. And you discover something simple and true. You're no longer alone. Because that part of you that you thought was lost was always there, waiting to say, thank you for coming back. And if something I said reminded you of your own story or stirred something inside you, feel free to share it in the comments. I'd really love to hear it. What you have to say matters, not just to me, but maybe to someone else who's going through something similar. Sometimes putting it into words is already part of the healing. If something inside you still wants to understand yourself, there's another video waiting for you on the screen. And maybe what's in there is exactly what you've been needing to hear. Click it, if that's where your soul is asking to go.